Hello, and welcome to Nerdverse Unshuffled, a geeky podcast where we introduce you to the language of board games. We are your hosts, Jacques van Heerden and Fayard Hendricks.
Welcome to this episode where we look at board game components. And it's also where we're going to get into even more trouble with prospective pedants because we haven't distinguished between board games, card games, dice games so far. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, I think.
Yay! So, in this episode, we look at all the physical parts that make up the variety of board games that we know and love.
Yeah, we won't be doing a deep dive on any one component, but we will try to give an overview of all the different stuff that you'll find in board games, or the card game box, or a dice game, or whatever it is that you happen to have in front of you. So many of these components might be familiar. You might have had Monopoly money as you were growing up, or the Cluedo pieces. But let's get into the definition of things.
Components, or what are components? What do we mean when we talk about board game components? Components can include any number of things that you would find listed in the section called components in a game's manual. But to make it less intimidating and confusing, we have tried to group them into what I should stress are extremely broad categories. Do not hold us
Very
to
broad.
this. They're not formal definitions. They are very informal, but it will hopefully make it a lot easier to just keep track of all the wonderful bits and pieces.
And it'll make it easier for us to talk about the pieces and the bits and bobs that become a board game.
Indeed.
So I think firstly and most importantly for a lot of the games, there is the game board itself. Some games don't have a game board, but many do. And it's such a big, ubiquitous part of the games that just about anything that we play on a tabletop we call a board game, even if they don't have boards like I've mentioned. I know that for a lot of board gamers who are big into the hobby, a big word that they tend to use is table presence, and just how big and impressive this game looks on the table, because sometimes a game can look unassuming and it's fantastic, and sometimes the game looks fantastic and amazing and it's big, but then the gameplay doesn't quite deliver the promise of what the show and the pomp and fancy is. And I think designers and artists and so on try to manage that balance of getting the presence versus the gameplay thing going. Yeah.
And it's a big part of what a game ends up feeling like. If it does have a game board that everyone's using and referring to, it can make things a lot easier. It can make things a lot more difficult. If there's too much stuff going on, it becomes very intimidating to keep track of, like, well, hang on, actually what's happening and where am I supposed to be looking and what am I focusing on?
Oh, yeah.
But if it's done well, and they've really put thought into it, it's just one more aid to help the players remember what they're doing.
Very good graphic design, yes. I mean, most boards will have a shared scoring track, for example, so that will allow you to understand at a glance whether I am doing well or not. And some games don't have scoring tracks because all the scoring is done on a scorepad afterwards, and you've got no idea how well you're doing. But that's beside the point.
Yeah, and then some games use a combination of those two things, which drive me up the wall. But I'm very picky.
That brings us to the next set of components, and those are the ones that we use to describe the whole categories of games that are in and of themselves. So what do we mean by that? Here we're talking about cards, we're talking about dice, we're talking about cardboard chits, we're talking about plastic, we're talking about wooden bits that loosely represent things, we're talking about plastic miniatures, which often are more representative of something very specific, like armies and zombies and people. If a game uses one of these components as its primary or even its only component, we often refer to it in shorthand as a card game, a dice game, a mini-based game. Because that tells us a lot about what we can expect to find when we're playing it. But it doesn't mean that the game can't then combine all the different elements. So, for example, I mean, Kemet, Blood and Sand, is described as a minis game, right? And the minis are beautiful and impressive. But the game also includes a whole bunch of cards. In the original Kemet, there's dice that are used to represent pyramids and things. So just because it's described as a minis game doesn't mean that that's the only component in use. And in some games, even the box used to store the game is used as its own component.
Oh, yeah. No, I think that's a great innovation that a couple of games have used. And obviously, not everybody uses it,
but being able to describe a game very loosely by its majority of its components, so as a card game, a dice game, or like Twister, even a dexterity game, it serves as a very useful shorthand to be able to distinguish between the different kinds of experiences that you're going to have around the table. But having said that, there is so much variety in each category. There are literally dozens and dozens of genres of card game, and just as many types of game that use miniatures, for example.
Yeah. So mini is short for miniature figurine and describes a molded plastic figure used in gaming, distinct from wooden meeples that represent animals or human characters. They can be any kind of manufactured piece that's meant to resemble something specific. So whether it's based around the theme of the game itself, or if the minis are almost the main focus of the game. So war games, especially, and that we'll cover in a separate episode. But that's just one way in which sort of a component can define the game that you're playing. So if you're thinking of a mini-based game, it's very different from a card game. There are very different experiences and sort of expectations that you're setting.
So for many of the games that use minis, they tend to be a deluxe add-on because there's such an extra cost associated with producing and packaging and shipping that amount of heavy plastic. And sometimes it does make the game prohibitively expensive. Scythe and Kemet are games that come standard with minis. There's no option to get a non-miniature version because part of the fun of the game is manipulating these plastic things around. A game like Anachrony, for example, is an example of a game where you can buy a pack of minis to enhance your gameplay. The tactile feeling of moving and touching and placing those plastic bits, there's something joyous about it that you don't get out of moving cardboard chits around, which is the alternative with what Anachrony comes with, for example.
So we were actually playing a game recently. It's quite fun placing the trains on the board or moving your little race car the set number of spaces ahead or backwards.
Correct, yeah. There's something about the tactile feeling of just moving pieces around that feel chunky, that feel satisfying to touch and hold. I think at this point we should probably mention what meeples are, go into a definition, because we've been talking about meeple a lot. We've mentioned it like at least 3 times. But for those who don't know what it is, the meeple is a vaguely humanoid-shaped wooden token. Some of them use plastic, acrylic, but mostly they're wood. The term was coined back in about 2000 when someone called Alison Hansel was playing a game of Carcassonne, and she confabulated the words "my" and "people" and into meeple. And the meeples from Carcassonne are the most recognized ones, and the term just kind of stuck, and Carcassonne actually uses it as the official term for their wooden figurines, meeples. But any similarly looking wooden piece is still called a meeple. It could be representative of any number of things. So, like I said, most of them are wood. Sometimes they're plastic or acrylic. You'll find plastic and acrylic meeples, for example, in Dinosaur Island or in Quadropolis.
Oh, yes.
But I do want to just state that meeple, like I said, it's not just humanoid shaped, because you can have like the animal shapes that you'll see in Isle of Cats or in Everdell. They're beautiful meeples. Agricola has these beautiful sheep. Caverna, its dwarf spin-off, has cows and dogs and all sorts of things. Root, all their meeples are these delightful, gorgeous little critters. So you've got mice and you've got cats and you've got birds of different varieties. You've got moles and so on. It's glorious. It's delightful, the amount of things you get in meeples.
So, yeah. So just by contrast tokens, counters, discs, and tiles can be completely abstract, and they often represent nothing much, but are meant to stand in for specific ideas or aspects of the game that you need to use in some
usually
way.
like money or
Yeah.
points or things like that.
Yeah. So their shape could be a crucial part of how they're used, or they could simply be a reminder of how they are different from the other components in the same game. You know, and they could very closely resemble their real world analogs. So the stone, wood, or gold tokens that are found in many games sort of almost look like the thing that they're representing, or they have some element of it. Whether that's the color or whether they try to match the shape somehow. So they've got irregular stone tokens and straight wood and trapezoid shapes of a gold bar.
Right. Let's move on to another fun piece, the polyomino. So according to Wikipedia, the polyomino is a plane geometric figure formed by joining one or more equal squares edge to edge. It is a polyform whose cells are squares. It is maybe regarded as a finite subset of the regular square tiling. But what this means in human readable English,
yes, please tell us.
It's what we'd call Tetris shapes. And for some reason, we tend to exclude dominoes from this category of games, even though they actually are absolutely polyominoes, or the simplest type. It's literally two squares joined together, and that's your polyomino. But games that use polyomino tiles, it's usually flat cardboard. Sometimes you get wooden ones, not often, but they do exist. But games that use polyominoes as tiles, they tend to be puzzle type games. And there's something about arranging tiles in a strategically pleasing way that makes these games such a joy to play.
Polyominoes are quite fun. I do like that sort of puzzle element in games. The other game that kind of comes to mind when you talk about strange components would be something like Cluster, which basically uses a set of very strong magnets, and you need to sort of figure out where to place them.
Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic example of a game that it's got no cards, it's got no dice, no boards. It's just a bunch of magnets and a shoelace.
Pretty much.
You know, the intrinsic properties of the magnets are what makes the game fun, because it's unpredictable, how strong or weak the fields are.
Yeah.
But that does bring us to, non-meeple pieces or non-card pieces. Because you're going to find that a lot of dexterity games, they're going to use their own bespoke wooden or plastic pieces.
Yeah.
And it can be anything from, it's as simple as the wooden blocks that you get in Jenga, or you're going to find, this really bizarre, obscure, esoteric shapes in a game like Junk Art.
Yes.
Where it's almost like an inverse Jenga. You're trying to put these shapes on top of each other in a way that doesn't fall, instead of trying to take things out like you do in Jenga.
And then you're also trying to palm off really impossible pieces on your opponents.
Absolutely. That's what makes, Junk Art so much fun.
Yes.
But you'll also find other, non-representative shapes in a lot of abstract games. So even old games or new games. So Othello and Go, checkers, those are simple circles of stone, wood, plastic, whatever it is they're made of. And you're going to get newer games like Yinch, Quirkle, which is absolutely gorgeous pattern matching game. Those use wooden tiles, plastic pieces. Bakelite is a plastic that Yinch uses.
Yeah, so I haven't played either Yinch or Quirkle, so we should probably fix that at some point. But
we should.
Some games just really have very interesting components, and I love it when there's something unique about the components sets the game apart.
Yeah.
But I think in a lot of times that falls under that category that you were talking about earlier about the deluxe meeples.
Yeah.
We can come back to. I don't know. What would you say would be your favorite offbeat, unusual component that you've ever seen in a board game?
Gosh. So it's interesting that a lot of games tend to have very similar-ish looks and feels. And I mean, if something that comes, easy to mind is like Cthulhu Wars, those massive miniatures, they stand out quite strongly.
Mm.
But a game like Tokyo Highway, it's unusual. It's got a beautiful table presence. It's these wooden cylinders and what look like ice lolly sticks with cars stuck on them. And you're basically creating this little highway and placing the cars on the highways, and you're trying to make things not fall. As there's a lot of dexterity games, but it looks gorgeous. You know, it is certainly quite memorable when you see it on the table.
Mm.
And yourself?
I don't know. I tend to like games that do something very clever and elegant and well thought out with the kinds of pieces that we'd see more often. So, I mean, the difference between a well-designed board and a poorly designed board is so occasionally esoteric, but also such a big change in terms of how the game works.
Could be a line so thin you could shave with it.
Yeah. Well, I would actually say that one of my favorite components was actually the gavel from Modern Art.
I love that gavel.
It's such a silly component that doesn't actually add anything to the game. I mean, you don't need a gavel at all.
Absolutely.
But it is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And we like the other example of this was we played Pit, which is an old game from 1904.
Yeah.
The other day. And it was great because, I mean, and again, this is completely unnecessary, but there's a bell that you smack and it rings up, and it's a sign that the round has started. It's a sign that somebody has finished, that they've collected the number of cards that they need. And
it's also a sign that someone has poor restraint and couldn't refrain from hitting the bell. That happened a couple of times.
Well, it happened a couple of times because it was a great way to get things started.
Yeah.
It's like, oh well, we're still putting our cards together. No, start. Bang. Slap.
Must press the bell.
Push the bell. It was the
very tree in Everdell. Is one that comes to mind as something that has a fantastic table presence. I love it so much. Just because, once again, it's also completely superfluous to the game. You do not need this gigantic three-dimensional tree standing on your table, to hold certain components. And in fact, the developers of the game acknowledge this by releasing an expansion for the game that completely takes away the tree. But if you want that table presence, well, you got to assemble the Everdell tree. It's what you do.
Yeah.
Flamecraft is another one. The components are completely twee. They are so cute. I mean, the game's fantastic as well, but it's got the cutest component, little dragons. If you got the Kickstarter edition, the beautiful dragon miniatures that come with it. But I'm reminded of another, set of components that we tend to forget quite easily, and that's literally simple pen and paper.
Oh, right, yeah.
Or in the games, dry erase boards and dry erase markers. So a game like Telestrations, for example, the entire game is predicated off people writing and drawing things. And aside from the deck of cards that gives you the things to draw or write, that's literally all you get in the box is a bunch of dry erase boards and markers.
Yeah.
But it is so much fun.
It's amazing what a well thought out game with very few components can do to create a lot of fun and excitement and
absolutely
kind of momentum at the table, where like people are like, yes, let's do it again. Yes, let's pause for a bit here and we'll be back after the break. Hi, Jacques here from Unshuffled. Thank you for downloading and listening to the show. We're a very new channel and we really appreciate your support. If you like what we do, please like and subscribe to hear about new episodes. If you'd like access to bonus features, reviews, discussions, affiliate links, and more fun downloads, consider supporting us on Patreon or Ko-fi if you're financially able. Otherwise, you can always help us get the word out about the show by leaving us a positive review on your favorite podcast app. And now back to what we were talking about. Wait, what were we talking about?
Should we talk briefly about the history of board game components?
Yes, I mean, we obviously we didn't want to do too much extensive research on which component was introduced in which year and do like a chronological breakdown, because the focus is on what do we talk about when we mention components What kinds of things are maybe you're not that familiar with? Maybe which things are, require a little bit more experience with a variety of games. Some of them are in very few sort of examples.
Yeah. And some are completely ubiquitous, like dice, for example. You're going to see them everywhere amongst the oldest components there are. But I think we'll find that components are just about as old as games and in themselves are. And I'm fairly sure that if we look back at what early humans were doing as play, you'd find stones, bones, branches, and things in amongst that. But in terms of the oldest board game that we know of, we spoke about this in an early episode. We mentioned that the Royal Game of Ur, it's one of the earliest board games that we know about. And, aside from the board, which was, not made of cardboard, obviously it was made of clay at the time, it still had components that you moved around the table, moved around this board. It was, you got games such as Mancala, which come out of Africa. And it's often just a series of holes that you dig in the ground. And anything that you could use as a round object, like stones, berries, seeds, whatever small round thing, those are what you use as components in the game Mancala. And for a lot of human history, when we talk about, games and fun and games in terms of what we understand as board games, it's going to come with a measure of components.
Yeah. How old did we say Go is?
Go is ancient. It originates from ancient China.
Because those must be then some pretty old components.
Yeah, the game it's about 2,500 years old. I think scientists, historians do believe that Go is the oldest board game that is still played today. You could argue that the Royal Game of Ur, people do play it, but we don't know the rules. We don't have the definitive rules for the Royal Game of Ur, but we do have for Go.
Yeah, I would be interested to see when exactly cards were added.
Oh, playing cards. Playing cards are relatively recent. We're looking at around the 9th century AD.
Oh, okay.
That's what, you're 800. Compared to 2,500 years of Go versus what's that? Just over 1,000 years for playing cards.
Yeah,
I think Go has it beat by quite a margin.
Wow. Okay. But yeah, so that's a very sort of broad overview of component, the history of components. The one thing we haven't talked about in terms of components is sort of table hogs. Like which games are just have so many components, or the components are so big and they're so sort of elaborate that it just sort of ends up you kind of need a whole separate room just dedicated to board gaming, so you can even get the whole game onto one table.
Absolutely, right? There are some games that there's too much presence, as it were. We recently played Distilled. That's fairly big. But I've seen photographs of people playing Twilight Imperium.
Yes.
And that one just looks like a monster of a game. It's a game that reportedly takes 5 hours to play.
For good reason.
But it takes up an entire table and then some, just to have the game all spread out.
Yeah.
I think there's a point beyond which it almost becomes unfriendly if there's too much game, because you need to spread out so much of stuff. When A Feast for Odin, it is quite a table hog on its own, but not as egregious as a Twilight Imperium.
Yes. Yeah, whenever you see photos of people playing Twilight Imperium, you go like, did you have to hire a hall? Like, how did you actually manage to get this game on anything? Are you playing on the floor? How many tables did you have to buy and put together? But
the audacity of having more than one copy on the same continent.
it's sometimes it does get a bit overwhelming, but it does still help to know a little bit about all these components and have an idea of what they're used for and how they can add to a game, and all the different ways in which people have used them. And
Correct.
you know, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about board games without having some idea of what the components are.
Correct. Yeah. Did we mention money at all?
We did talk about money a little bit, or at least tangentially.
So in terms of board game upgrades, that's the one popular one is metal coins.
Yes.
Instead of the cardboard coins that come with the game. Some games come with plastic coins. Some games come with poker chips as your money, and you can buy an entire box of upgrade poker chips, deluxe poker chips, that are specifically used for board gaming.
My least favorite form of money in board games is paper money.
Yes, aka Monopoly money. I'm not fond of them either.
I'm not a fan of that. I give me some tokens or coins or something. I will figure out a way to make it make sense. But
when Power Grid, for example, comes with paper money, I'm not fond of that. Raccoon Tycoon comes with plasticized paper money, which is a slightly better experience,
I suppose,
but not by very much.
No.
I'm a big fan of metal coins.
Yeah,
I find it difficult to stay away from official sets of metal coins for games where they exist.
Yes, it's something I keep thinking I should invest in, and then never quite get around to.
It's a rabbit hole.
It's definitely on my list, and we are definitely not talking about geek bits on this podcast. We are definitely not talking about them.
Oh no! You know what? Why not? You know what? They are upgraded components again. Yes. So the Board Game Geek store offers these. I think it's Bakelite again, but molded plastic pieces to replace your cardboard components in your board games.
It's very unfair. It's very unfair that it exists and that it's so far away and so expensive.
And that shipping is so expensive to our part of the world. Yes. But my word, they look absolutely gorgeous. I mean, I'm particularly enamored at the Wingspan ones.
I mean, we've spoken about how all these sort of component terms help us in a very broad way, but there are very specific ways, and knowing which components are in the box also helps you figure out whether or not something is worth your time.
And sometimes worth the money that you're paying for it.
So one of the things what I've started doing is if I'm buying a card game, for example, I would be very hesitant to pay over a certain threshold if all that is in the box is a set of cards.
Correct.
And sometimes when you look at these really, really beautiful games that have very impressive miniatures on it, you kind of already are convincing yourself not to buy it because you know that those are that immediately means lots of investment.
I think with games like, for example, Zombicide and Tainted Grail and Cthulhu, games that have a lot of miniatures and a lot of impressive miniatures, it's almost like there's a Stockholm syndrome thing going on where people feel like they need to justify the purchase and the cost of it. Cognitive dissonance, where I paid this much for it, I must like the game, even if the game itself is not that much fun.
Yeah, you obviously you can't really tell without playing a game. I mean, I think one of the reasons that we bought the original version of Kemet was because we liked the minis and the obviously the theme of the game, but it looked impressive. It looked like it was going to be an impressive experience on a table that you kind of would revisit a lot, and that is definitely true.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to get more Kemet to the table. I wouldn't say no to Gamma Kemet.
That's something we definitely should put on the roster. I mean, I've also played games of really impressive miniatures that I haven't been that in love with, even if it did perhaps have a theme or something that I thought, okay, well, I should like this, but at the heart of
something fell flat.
Yeah, because the mechanics I think the mechanics always are going to trump the components.
In every single case, I've never seen a game where the components outdid the mechanics and the game was better for it. It's the mechanics always will take first place. But in terms of, just how this jargon helps us again, I mean, you're going to see the term meeple a lot in modern board gaming. And it helps to know, what isn't a meeple. And you'll find that in terms of wooden figurines, there are very few things that aren't meeples.
Yeah.
And in terms of, understanding where your luck versus strategy element's going to lie, if you look at the component list, if you see a set of dice, odds are there's going to be a chunk of luck. Not always, because you look at a game like Beyond the Sun, for example, there is absolutely no luck, beyond the shuffling the cards.
Yeah.
You're not rolling dice to determine outcomes. And if you're the kind of person who dice hate, like myself, you're going to want to stay away from games that are very heavily based on the outcome of a roll.
Yeah.
So for myself, I tend to stray more towards the strategy end of things.
Yes, because strategy you can always do something about, or you can get better at it. Luck is just what it is. Like
exactly.
You have good luck or you don't have good luck at the table. And if your experience I think for me, if my enjoyment of a game is going to devolve completely to a question of luck, I'm probably not going to enjoy it that much unless it's really quick and you can play a bunch of it. So, I mean, I think the basic point to remember is looking at a board game and trying to figure out whether you're going to enjoy it or not, or what experience you're going to get. If you look at the combination of the mechanics and the components, you'll have a relatively good idea of at least what to expect.
Yeah.
And then just play it and see whether you actually enjoy it or not.
If you make a call between the components of the game and the mechanics that you'll see in the game, which you'll find on Board Game Geek, that'll give you a fairly good idea of what to expect from the game, even if there may be surprises, in the actual gameplay.
Yes.
Knowing what you do and don't like regarding components and regarding mechanics will mean that you're a more informed buyer, and that you'll be buying the game. Look, if you're a board gamer, you're going to be buying a lot of games. It's almost like a rule.
Well,
but
yes, it's very difficult not to.
Or you'll have friends who buy a lot of them. But knowing what you do and don't like will also allow you to avoid unpleasant experiences with games. If you know that, no, this is something that's definitely out of my range of what I like.
Yes. And I think if we can leave you with any thoughts about components, it's that a good component can make a game you enjoy a lot better, regardless of whether it actually adds anything specifically to the mechanics. Like ringing a bell or hitting a gavel or placing trains or zombies on a map. Whatever those components do. But good components are never going to make up for a bad game or a game that you don't enjoy or doesn't do anything that kind of intrigues you or
that said
gives you a kick.
Bad components can ruin an
otherwise
okay game.
Perfect game.
Yeah. We'd love to hear feedback from our listeners, and if you let us know what your favorite or least favorite component is, something that you've hated or loved, we'd love to hear from you, and we may feature you in a future episode.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely something that I would love to hear what people's experiences are like.
I think let's leave it at that.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. You can follow us on various platforms and join the conversation on Discord. Links in the episode description wherever you found this podcast. You can find articles and discussions about the terms used in this podcast over at nerdverse.co.za. You can also find articles on a host of other subjects, including tabletop role-playing games, interviews, events, and how-tos. Your hosts were Jacques van Heerden and Fjord Hendricks. Music editing and producer, Fjord Hendricks. Executive producer, Jacques van Heerden. Unshuffled is a Nerdverse Productions podcast.